Welcome to my temporary studio, everyone. Since I'm currently traveling and unable to post my usual art material reviews and drawing instruction, I thought this would be a great opportunity to expand my usual content and cover a topic that is at the very heart of being an artist, the creative process. Coming up with ideas and seeing them through fruition is something that every artist, from beginning to master, has to struggle with. And learning how to do it should be an integral part of artistic training. So my plan in this video is to take you through every step of the creative process from ideation to final execution and give you what I think is essential advice on how to create work efficiently, effectively, and most importantly, on deadline. Let's get started. I should note that this process applies to work that has a conceptual element to it and is complex in nature, work where you're combining visual reference materials and trying to communicate ideas through a narrative painting or illustration. So if you're an abstract artist whose work relies on improvisation and spontaneity, or a representational artist doing strictly observational work, landscape, still life, portrait, etc., this system might not be for you, though you still might find elements in it that are useful. Furthermore, this particular way of working is what works for me, based on the kind of work that I enjoy doing. Ultimately, it's up to every artist to arrive at their own creative process based on the kind of work they do. And my hope is that this video, at the very least, will spur you to start thinking about this crucial and yet often overlooked part of artistic training. While in some cases, ideas for paintings come into one's mind fully formed, in most cases, an artist will have only a very vague idea of what a painting is going to be. Think of this initial inclination to do a painting as a frail seed, which through careful cultivation will eventually sprout and grow into a mature plant. So what is the first step? Nourishment. This can be done by simply thinking about your idea and its possibilities, by going for a walk, sitting down for a cup of coffee. But in reality, for most of us, creativity does not occur in a vacuum, by sitting in an empty room, staring at a wall. It happens by feeding our minds through a variety of sources. In my case, since I enjoy reading, my first step is to feed my brain by reading about the subject I plan to explore. This could be fiction that explores similar themes, or a scientific treatise, poetry, Wikipedia articles, Twitter posts, really anything that helps me understand my subject and jumpstarts my imagination. My next step is visual research, where I look at works of art that deal with similar themes. This is valuable for a number of reasons. One, it can potentially inspire you to create work in a similar vein. Two, and perhaps more important, it allows you to avoid mistakes that other artists have already made, to see possible pitfalls in your potential idea, and avoid well-trodden paths in terms of cliches. Now let's talk about the concept study stage. Let's say I want to do a painting or an illustration based on the theme, the idea that a lot of content creators feel intense pressure to constantly be uploading videos to YouTube, and that YouTube sometimes feels like some kind of god that needs to be sacrificed to, or some kind of punishment will ensue. This is something that I definitely feel. I definitely feel that kind of pressure, and I'm sure a lot of other people that make videos for YouTube also feel. So I've done my reading, I've done my visual research, and now it's time to come up with ideas. Here's how this works. I'm going to sketch out a few squares. The dimensions of these squares are not terribly important. These could be rectangular, they could be square, they could be circular. It really doesn't matter, because we're not really worried about composition here, we're not worried about layout, we're just trying to put down ideas. Usually, the size I work in is 2 by 2 inches, but it could be smaller, it could be larger. I wouldn't work much larger, because that's going to force you to introduce detail that's not really necessary at this point. So the idea here is to fill every single square with a different way, a different approach of creating this illustration. So the idea that YouTube demands constant sacrifice might lead me to create an idea that kind of looks like this. We have an iPhone, which is a representation of YouTube. Maybe I'll have the YouTube logo. Maybe that's a little bit too much on the nose. And then we have some kind of hilltop, and then we have a bunch of people carrying some kind of content. It might be content creators, might be people up here. Maybe we'll have some kind of mountaintop up here. Keep it really, really super rough. Don't shade, don't render, don't introduce detail. Just put down the very barest indications of what your idea is going to be. And then just so you remember exactly what you did, it's a good idea to caption your image. So, I don't know, content creators sacrificing to YouTube, right? So, sacrifice. Okay, and then move forward to your next idea. So, perhaps a slightly different approach where we have some kind of arena here, and we have a bunch of viewers being represented by phones, right? Maybe get a little bit smaller this way, and then there's a person here, I don't know, on a unicycle juggling, right? And a bunch of phones are watching. Again, don't worry about composition, don't worry about how effective it is visually at this point, but we could say arena filled with phones. Let's do a few more. Okay, let's say there's some kind of pit here, and then let's say there's a platform here, and inside the pit are a bunch of phone teeth going this way. I'm not saying these ideas are any good. I'm just using this as an example, right? And then we have people jumping in, I guess content creators, right? People that make videos for YouTube, falling into this pit of endless demand, bottomless pit of demand, so on and so forth. A few things. Does every single idea have to be completely separate from each other? No, it doesn't. So you can work in similar ideas. So for example, something like this could be, let's see, we have some kind of temple situation where at the center we have a phone. Maybe it has legs. It's sitting in some kind of position of power. There's a throne here, and maybe it's surrounded by phones this way, and then we have a steady stream of people coming up to it, offering all different kinds of sacrifices. So these are kind of similar ideas. In fact, all of these are similar in terms of the fact that they deal in different ways with the same theme. Again, the endless demand for videos that a lot of content creators feel pressured to make. You do want to explore the possibilities. So if you make all the ideas exactly the same, you're not going to have a range of options to choose from. So that's really, really important. They should be different enough that they represent a separate idea, all related to the original theme that you started working with. Now, a few things about the concept study that are very, very important. Now, this is actually a very important discipline. Choose either a number for your concept studies or a very set, defined time. It could be 5 concept studies. It could be 10. It could be 20. It really depends on your own work process. And if you're working professional and you need to meet deadlines, then it's definitely set, definitely based on the amount of time you're being given. Or it could be a strictly defined amount of time. This is really important because if you're a creative person, you can constantly generate ideas, keep coming up with ideas endlessly. So if I was given 5 months to do this, I would put down, I don't know, maybe 500 ideas, 600 ideas. You have to limit this process because at some point you have to stop, make a decision about which of these concept studies you want to do, and move forward. So very, very important to set a limit. Whether it's a number or a period of time, really depends on you and your working methods. So a lot of artists will say, okay, I have a month to do this project. I'm going to spend a week just developing ideas. So I'll work every day. I'll put down a few different ideas every day. I'll go for a walk. I'll sleep on the idea. Maybe the following morning I'll come up with something. Set a strict time or set a strict number. This is very, very important. Now, there are essentially 4 rules when you guys are coming up with studies. The first one is to not fall in love with your very first idea. Because here's what happens, at least in the classroom, it happens quite often. When I assign students midterms or final projects, I have them do 10 concept studies. And that's usually my standard number. If I'm working on a larger project, maybe I'll do more, but 10 is sort of my go-to. So I assign 10 concept studies. the students come up with an idea, and then they instantly have a concept idea. They put it down, and they fall in love with it. So they look at it, and they go, oh my God, this has so much potential. I'm going to include all kinds of ragged mountains in the background, and then here I'm going to include texture, maybe there's a light here. They're already starting to move beyond the concept study stage into the compositional stage, into the finished piece stage. They fall in love. And then what happens is, well, gosh, Mark, he's forcing me to do 9 more. So they fill the rest of the concept studies with ideas they don't really care about. The students are no longer engaged. They're just filling the squares for the sake of filling the squares. Their minds are no longer active. They're no longer pursuing options. Why? Because they're locked in. The problem with doing that is that, yes, potentially your first idea can be your best. Such things do happen. But if you fall in love with your first idea, you lose the opportunity, the chance that your 8th idea, your 7th idea will top it. And often what happens is when you first start working on a project, because your creative juices aren't flowing, you're not fully exploring the ideas, your first idea is the most obvious, the one that most people can possibly think of. And if you give yourself time and you start pushing in all kinds of different directions, chances are by your 5th and 6th, you'll start generating better ideas. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh my God, I'm so glad that I didn't fall in love with idea number 1 because idea 9 is better. So whatever the number you set, keep your mind open. Try to fill every concept study with your best possible idea. And then when you're done with either the defined time or the defined number, you stop, look through your ideas, and choose your best option. Now, if idea number 1 is the best one, fine, that's perfectly okay. But I guarantee you that after doing 10 or spending 2 weeks on the concept study, you'll come up with something better. Okay? So that is the first thing. Do not fall in love with your first idea. Keep the options open. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that often when you're coming up with ideas, you start censoring yourself. Right? So you come up with an idea, and as you're doing it, it happens almost instantly, you say, oh, that's a stupid idea, and I'm going to block it out. Right? The fact is, often an idea can be incredibly stupid. Such things are possible. But it's a little bit hard to tell at the beginning. Right? So often you're looking at something and it is indeed stupid. But if you tweak the idea a little bit, right? So as opposed to somebody juggling and dancing a unicycle, maybe instead something a little bit closer conceptually to the theme. We can have an artist that is working on a painting here. So something a little bit less circus-like atmosphere, but the artist is doing something serious. So even a kind of a dumb idea at the beginning, if tweaked a little bit, I'm not saying this is any smarter. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It can be tweaked a little bit to make it more interesting. So these are not final ideas. These are, going back to the seed analogy, weak little seeds that need to be watered before they flower, they shoot out roots, and create something that is sturdy and coming into full fruition. So don't self-censor yourself at this stage. This is brainstorming. You're putting down basically whatever comes to your head. And then, once you're done, then you can examine your ideas and think about whether they're smart or not, whether they communicate what you actually want to say through your illustration, right? But as you're doing it, don't self-censor. And there is a few other reasons why people censor themselves. So first of all, they don't have confidence in the idea. But another really common source of self-censorship is fear. Fear that the image is going to be too difficult to actually execute, or is going to be too much work. One of those two things, right? So for example, in this one, okay, we have an arena, we have a bunch of iPhones. If I want to do this sort of semi-realistically, I need to deal with perspective. There's some architecture involved. There are 50 different phones. Maybe the idea is that each phone contains the face of a different viewer. Oh my God, I have to render faces, I have to render an arena. I'm not going to do it. I'm scared to, right? It's going to be either too much work or it's going to be too difficult, kind of beyond my capacity. Do not let fear or laziness, fear of the difficulty or the fear of the hard work, censor your ideas. Put down your best idea. because part of creativity is taking something that is difficult and finding creative solutions to overcoming the difficulties. So for example, for this concept study, well, do I need 500 different phones? Do I need to show the entire arena? I really don't. Right? Through composition, I can simplify this idea. So for instance, I can have a few phones in the foreground blocking out the tremendous detail in the background. So we have a few phones here going this way, indicating the audience in the foreground. Right? And then maybe I have a few phones kind of going back here this way. That limits the amount of detail I have to put in. And then I can make the figure in the center a little bit bigger. So as opposed to having a composition with 100 different elements in it, we have the same idea, but I've simplified it. And actually, probably a composition like this, where there's a stronger foreground, is probably stronger than a composition where things are zoomed out and there's lots of little details that, especially in an illustration, are going to be hard to read. So again, that's part of creativity. Taking a difficult theme with potentially a lot of work and through some creative compositional machinations, making it simpler. So that's rule number 2. Do not let the difficulty of the concept keep you off of it, right? Push you away, scare you, right? Don't let fear or laziness govern your creative decisions. Put down your very best ideas with each concept study. And the last rule to follow religiously when doing concept studies is that when you're done with the process of whatever the set number is, 5, 10, or the set time, you're going to go back, look through your ideas, and choose your best idea with the perfect confidence that it's impossible to make a fully informed choice. The distance from your concept study to the final piece is tremendously long, and it goes through lots of different steps of feeding the idea, working out the composition, working out the values, if you're working with color, adding color to it. This concept study is just the starting point. We have no idea where it's going to end up. So at this stage, it's incredibly difficult to make a fully informed choice, right? So choose one, whichever one attracts you, and choose with the perfect confidence that it's impossible to choose wisely here, right? It's all guesswork. Even at the most advanced stages of art making, it's incredibly difficult to anticipate where a project is going to end up, right? Make a choice and move forward to the compositional study. So I've got 4 here. Let's make a choice. Let's see. Well, I like this temple idea, right? So let's go with it and move forward to the compositional study. In the concept study, the format wasn't terribly important. In the compositional study, it's incredibly important. So if you have a predetermined format, let's say a canvas that's 18 by 24 inches, you want to create rectangles that are proportional to the final image. Because there is absolutely no point in working out a composition inside a square if your ultimate image is rectangular. One easy way to get the proportion right in your compositional studies is to look at the diagonal from one corner to the other. So if we have an 18 by 24 surface, like this, right, we're going to have a certain diagonal from one corner to the other. So when sketching out your proportional studies, you're going to start by drawing the front edge, top and bottom of the rectangle, and then take this angle and transfer it. This way you can make compositional studies of any size you want, but they're still going to be the same proportion as your final canvas. Now, if you're not certain what your format is, then your compositional studies should play with different formats. A longer format, shorter format, whatever it is. But in most cases, when I'm doing illustrations or paintings, I already have a canvas prepared. I already have a certain format. And I think that's a good idea from the very beginning. Start thinking about what the format's going to be. Okay, so in this case, just like the compositional study, we can have either a set number or a set time for this process. I'm going to do 3 compositional studies. And since we're dealing with a rectangle, I can have two with a vertical format, and then I'm also going to experiment with a horizontal format. Again, the most important thing is that when you're doing compositional studies, these boxes need to be proportional to the dimensions of your final image. Now, you want to make sure that these compositional studies are larger. So where the concept study can be really any format. Again, you don't want it too small or too big, but let's say 2 by 2 inches. These need to be large enough to accommodate enough detail so you can actually work out what the final composition is going to be. So in this case, I recommend a format of 3 by 4 inches, right? Something a little bit larger, 4 by 5. It's okay. I wouldn't go any larger than that because then it starts becoming a little bit harder to deal with. So you want it large enough so you can work with a little bit of detail, but not so big that the process becomes overwhelming. Okay, so if you remember, my concept that I chose was some kind of temple where we have a central figure that perhaps has legs, maybe not. Maybe I'll have some kind of screen image in the center here, and then we have a bunch of attendants standing here, and then we've got this kind of row of people coming up front. I'm not sure what they have exactly, but maybe it could be different kind of art-related paintings. Maybe there could be a dancer here, musicians. They're all kind of offering their wares to the YouTube god, the social media god. Okay. In the concept studies, I really wasn't worried about compositions, right? You can use stick figures. You want to just have just enough so you can remember what the idea actually was. And again, captioning the idea is really important. In the compositional study, we really want to think about, well, the rules of composition, and we want to work large enough so that we can determine how much space things are occupying. We're thinking about the design here. Now, in order to do compositions, you need to follow a certain set of rules. And I'm going to link to several videos that I have on composition. One on the basics of composition, and one that's a little bit more complex called the conceptual rules of composition. So I'll link to those two videos. You really should be working with some compositional rules when you're coming up with compositional studies. Otherwise, this process is going to feel entirely random. But let's do a few compositional studies. So here we have a centered composition, which might actually be useful for kind of like this semi-religious image here. But I think sometimes off-centering the composition can make something stronger. That's one of the rules of composition, off-centering a little bit. So as opposed to having things centered, maybe we have something with more diagonals in it. We have some kind of temple space. Going this way, a little bit of depth here. Maybe we have this guy sitting on some kind of pedestal. Like this. We have people. Now, you don't want to get into too much detail, but when you're drawing elements in your composition, we're no longer dealing with stick figures. We're dealing with shapes. So when it comes to figures, you can use things that look like this to work out how much space the figures are occupying. We're thinking about different alignments, right? Overlaps. However, we're not going into tremendous amount of detail. This is the basic general arrangement of shapes, not the details. So we could decide, for instance, the temple has some kind of arched ceiling here. We could decide that maybe there's some kind of fancy column here, and then there's some kind of recessed space, and here we have a balcony, and we have a bunch of phones that are leaning over this way. And then I had this idea that as opposed to kind of being cartoony and giving the phones hands and arms, maybe inside we have some kind of shadowy figures representing dark corporate interests. Let's see what's happening here. Maybe we have the same way that a lot of Gothic cathedrals have these balconies where the bishops, the cardinals are seated. Okay, and then we have this row of figures. You can see I'm spending a little bit more time working out the compositional principles, but there really is a balance here. I don't want to go into too much detail here. I want to retain as much flexibility at this stage as possible to move things around. So for instance, right now, it looks like these phones are sitting on top of the main phone. So I'm careful about my overlaps here, for example. And then maybe it's a little bit of kind of cartooning element. Maybe this phone has a little bit of a twist to it. And then, okay, so I'm going to keep these with figures, and maybe the central figure, I'm going to have some kind of weird blue light, that blue computer screen light coming out of it. Maybe we have some kind of architectural details here, stairs, maybe there's a carpet here, and then let's see, let's introduce a little bit of a stronger foreground. Again, I'm really thinking about the rules of composition here. Composition is a complicated subject that obviously deserves more than one video. I can't really talk about here, but if you're interested in the rules of composition that I follow, my thought process when dealing with compositions, I'll include some videos on it for you. Okay, so maybe we'll have a few additional phones here. We have a secondary balcony in the bottom. And then, so again, some kind of shadowy figures back here. Okay. Again, there's a balance there. I don't want to put in so much detail that I'm committed to the composition, because you really want the opportunity to move things around, right? To decide, okay, this row is a little bit too even. I'm going to make this foreground figure a little bit larger, right? To break up the row, for example, right? Definitely do these in pencil. Don't do them in pen. That's going to give you more flexibility. And then maybe a little more variety. So this phone is going up this way. This one's tilting a little bit. Maybe we can have one figure and then another figure kind of whispering. Okay. Definitely don't shade these because we're going to think about values later. That's the next stage, right? So there's compositional study 1. Let's do another one. So look, I think a centered composition might be good, but centered compositions tend to be very static. They tend to be very centered, very still. So we're going to do something that's a little more dynamic and introduce a third perspective point here so that we don't have quite a composition that's quite as still. And then one of the rules is when you have a centered composition, you still want to find ways to off-center, right? Elements, include elements with diagonals in them so that at the very least, areas outside of the area of focus, which is centered, have some movement in them, right? So let's see. So we might have a centered composition here, but we'll have some deliberate off-centering here. So here, these bishops are going to be, these figures are going to be a little farther away here. And maybe we have one big figure on this side going in and bringing what other kind of content? Cooking content, pizzas, right? Then we have a violinist here. We have somebody holding their brushes here like this, right? Again, keep it specific enough in terms of shape, but don't start going into detail. Again, this process needs to have a defined limit to it. So in this case, and usually for my midterm projects, I assign 3 compositional studies to my students. In my normal work process, I usually do about 5. Sometimes on larger projects, I'll do more. I find that for me, within 5, I can usually work out the optimal composition. Some of you guys will work better with time. So I'll have a strict deadline. I'm going to spend a week on the concept studies, choose my favorite concept, then move to the compositional studies and spend a week on the compositional studies. And then I stop and I move forward. I choose my favorite composition and I move on to the next stage. As with the concept studies, don't fall in love with your first compositional idea, right? Give yourself options. Keep your mind open until you've done the set number. Again, whatever it is, right? Then, once you've spent an appropriate amount of time on your compositional studies, choose your favorite one and then move forward. Again, don't fall in love. Don't let fear or laziness govern your creative decisions, right? Though at this stage, you should be thinking about how much time you're going to spend on a composition, right? So something like this, which is kind of zoomed out, has a lot of architecture, is probably going to take more time than something where things are zoomed in. So for example, we can have something like this where we have this seated figure, and then we have more figures in the foreground kind of going around this way. Going this way, going this way, going this way, and then we can include a little bit less architecture. You can start thinking about creative ways of simplifying the image. But even at this stage, don't let fear of hard work or the difficulty of the project govern your creative decisions. And then once again, when you choose your compositional study, this choice is obviously going to be more informed than the concept study, definitely. But again, choose with perfect confidence, knowing that it's going to be very hard to figure out whether it's the correct decision or not. Just choose and move forward. If ultimately at some point, much farther in the stage, in the creative stage, you realize that you made some kind of compositional mistake, well, look, just treat it as an opportunity to make a better decision next time. These decisions are very difficult to make at the beginning, right? Especially when you're new to image creation. Eventually, over time, you're going to develop a stronger instinct for which compositions work better than others. But for right now, choose and move forward. Now, one little important trick when doing compositional studies, leave room around your compositional study. So when you sketch in your initial rectangle, leave a few inches all the way around. That gives you additional flexibility to adjust your composition. So for example, if I want to do a composition like this, and then I realize when I've done it that this area, for whatever reason, feels a little bit cramped, I want a little more room here. Leaving space around your compositional study allows you to expand your rectangle like this. Okay, now you instantly have more room. So often when you're composing, as opposed to moving things around in the picture, you can move things around by adjusting the frame. So expanding the frame or shifting it up a little bit. So for whatever reason, maybe I want to show a little bit more of the ceiling of this cathedral, which might be good to kind of indicate a sense of importance, tallness. You can shift the image up. If you make your compositional studies adjacent to each other, so you simply take a piece of paper and you grid it off into different formats, right? You lose that flexibility. So allow yourself a little bit extra flexibility by keeping space around your compositional studies. Okay, I've completed my compositional studies. Let's see, which one do I like? Well, okay, this one's the most fully realized, so I'm going to start going with this one and then move to the sketch phase. One, two, three, four, five. Once I've chosen my favorite compositional study, it's time to work it up to the final sketch. Now, the size of the sketch obviously will vary. It's up to you. I like to work around 9 by 12 inches. Why? Because that's the size of most of my sketchbooks. But it really depends on how big your final piece is going to be. So if you're doing a sketch for a large mural, probably the sketch should be fairly large. The idea is that obviously you don't want to work full size or close to full size. That would be silly. But you also don't want to work so small that you can't put in whatever details you plan to include in the final image. So this really depends on your comfort level and the size and detail of the final image. So in this case, I'm going to work approximately 9 by 12. You want to make sure that the rectangle you use for the final sketch is exactly proportional to the final image. There can be no deviation at all. And then in terms of media, you just want to think about it. If you're doing a painting in oil, acrylic, watercolor, you want to use a dry medium that approximates the contrast and the look of the final piece. You also want to use a medium that is highly correctable, that allows you to move things around. So my advice is to use charcoal or a technique called charcoal reduction, where I take a stick of compressed charcoal, I smear it. I have a video on it that I can link to in the description section. You can also use tone paper with black and white pencils, basically any medium that has a broad range of contrast, that is erasable, and allows you to blend would be a great final sketch medium for any kind of painting or illustration. What you don't want to do is use a linear medium, such as a pen, a ballpoint, something that requires cross-hatching, because that kind of technique is not going to transfer well over to a painting. So you want it to have lots of contrast, you want it to be correctable, you want it to be able to create lots of different effects. You can use graphite, of course, but if you're going to use graphite, make sure you use a range of graphite pencils so you can get strong contrast in your image. The other thing to think about before you start the final sketch is what reference material do you need to make the final sketch more specific and better. So my advice is to go back to your compositional study that you've chosen and do a little bit of inventory. Ask yourself, if you're going to be working realistically, if you're going to try to create convincing space and volume, what supporting materials do I need to make the sketch more compelling? So this might be reference material that you took from the internet. This could be photos that you've taken yourself. This could be drawing studies. If you're an old master, often they'll go to the studio and do little studies of various elements in the composition, and then use them to make this sketch. The idea is that you want to be, if you're painting realistically, to be as specific as possible. So you're going to start by just outlining the composition. Right, so if I remember correctly, the composition looked kind of like this, right? We had a room, right, inside of a cathedral, right? We had some steps going this way, some kind of platform going back in space. We had some decorative elements, and then we had some kind of recessed space here, some kind of balcony, right? Those full of iPhones, right? They're peering over at different distances, like so. And then we had kind of a pathway of poor content creators that are walking up and making their offering to YouTube, the YouTube gods, right? The compositional study was generic in terms of detail, right? So we got general sizes, scales, poses, right? When you're doing the final sketch, you want to get as specific as possible. So once you've done your compositional study, go through it and ask yourself, what is it exactly? So we have a figure. Who is this person? Okay, it's going to be a painter. So maybe that painter is holding a palette. Here's a thumb, we've got a bunch of paints, and there's a bunch of brushes there. What does the face look like? Are they wearing some kind of Rembrandt-like turban, right? Who is this person? Okay, so this person is lugging, I don't know, for some reason I have them holding the person's back here, but they're holding a violin. Okay, so we have a violin here, like this. So at this stage, you're going to get as specific as possible. What does that person's face look like? What does their hairdo look like? What do their costumes look like? Ask yourself, what is it? Be specific. This is one of the main principles of art making that I'm going to have to make a whole separate video on. Specific detail is always going to be more interesting than detail that's generic, right? So a figure that has no specific qualities is going to be less memorable than a figure that has all kinds of specific details. So at this stage, I'll probably think about exactly who this figure is, what the pose is, what they're wearing, what their costume looks like, what they're holding. Be specific, go through your composition, and fill it with specific detail. Now again, this is a whole topic that requires its own video. You don't have to be incredibly detailed everywhere, but you do want to be specific everywhere. So if we have a balcony, what does the balustrade look like? What does the architectural details look like? Maybe there's some kind of drape going over it. The phones are overlapping each other. What do these little characters inside the composition look like? Ultimately, this part of the composition could be entirely in shadow and just barely visible, receding off into the depths. But we still need to think through every part of the composition, which is a whole other topic. Be specific and think through every part of your composition. what is happening up here? What's happening here? This is often one of my go-to pieces of advice for my students. I look at their composition, and often the center of the composition, the area of focus, is fully realized. It's fully thought through. The student spent a lot of time thinking about what's happening there. But when it comes to the corners, not enough time is spent there. Right? Everything else is kind of afterthought after the main area of focus. Right? What's happening here? Is there a value transition? Right? Maybe there could be some kind of drape here to create some extra diagonals and to make the composition easier in terms of all the architectural detail that I'll have to include. Right? Think through every part of your composition and then make sure you shade it fully with the fullest range of value that you plan to include in the final piece. The idea is that when you guys are doing your sketches, you want to make all of the decisions in the sketch so that you don't have to make them in the final piece. So include every detail in the final sketch, every value in the final sketch that you plan to include in the final image. The idea being is that you fully work out what's happening in your image in the sketch, and when it comes time to work on the final illustration, all you have to do is transfer the image to a larger surface. Now, we can also add color, and we can add additional detail, but the most important decisions about what to include happen in the sketch stage. This is really important for a number of reasons. First of all, it makes the final execution of your project that much more efficient. Why? Because working in a more flexible medium on a smaller scale where it's easier to make those kind of decisions. That's number one. Number two, when you're working on a sketch, the stakes are lower. You can make corrections, you're working in a medium that's more correctable, you're not as nervous about making big decisions. If there are things in the sketch that are not fully developed, they're not fully realized, and then when you start working on the final sketch, on the final painting, you realize that you're going to have to make big decisions in the final painting, and that's going to screw you up. You're going to tend to make more conservative decisions because you're scared to mess up the image. And often, because you're working on a larger scale in a more complex medium with the additional complexity of color, you're going to mess up. So here is one of the mantras that I tell my students. You're never going to save time on the final image by saving time on the sketch. And in fact, there should be almost like an algorithm, right? An equation. Every additional 5 minutes spent on the sketch is going to save you 50 additional minutes, 5 additional hours on the final painting. There's always going to be stuff to do. There's always going to be additional decisions to be made, but the more you can work out in the final sketch, the easier time you're going to have in the final painting. And this is a lesson that you have to learn on your own. So try doing a piece without a sketch or a sketch that's not fully resolved and see what happens. You're going to be punished. You'll find yourself, again, screwing up, making changes, or just making poor decisions in your final piece because you haven't worked out what's happening in the final sketch. Okay? And this is a lesson that I've had to learn myself, relearn, right? Because often, due to limits in budget or limits in time or just personal laziness, I tell myself, okay, no one's going to hold me accountable. The client doesn't need a sketch. I'm just going to jump from the compositional study to the final piece, and I'm punished. Right? I realize that there are elements that I haven't fully worked out, and often what I do is I stop working on the final piece and I go back and actually finish the final sketch. So besides doing a fully finished final sketch, another time-saving device, even though it takes more time to do, is to work out any complicated area in your composition which you know is going to present some kind of problem. So for example, if I have a character that's holding some kind of tray filled with, I don't know, lots of content creators make food, right? So cupcake recipes, right? And we've got some kind of complicated hand pose here. In fact, I don't like the way the hand and the foot are lined up here. I'm going to have to change it. If I actually end up doing this image, which I probably won't. I might do a little separate hand study. So I'll get a reference of the hand, the cupcakes, perhaps the head, right? And then do a little separate study so that I have it next to me when I'm painting and I know exactly what the hands need to look like, what the cupcakes need to look like. This is something you'll find in old master drawings all the time. In the drawings of Michelangelo, for example, his studies of the Sistine Chapel, you'll see the main figure worked out in a drawing, and then right next to it you might see a little vignette of the head, or you might see him, if he's not happy with the way an arm turned out, right, some hand studies next to it. The reason why is because Michelangelo anticipated that those areas are going to be problematic, they're going to require more detail, more attention, and Michelangelo spent a little bit of extra time resolving those areas and working them out. So besides doing the final sketch, it's also incredibly helpful, if you're working realistically, if your image is going to have a lot of detail, to also do a bunch of separate studies. And this is something that you see artists doing over and over and over again. So when you look at artist drawings, you'll see final sketches. Often they're going to be very highly rendered, highly realized. And then you'll see detail studies as well. Again, you never save time by saving time on the final sketch. Right? It always costs you more time if you do a sketch that's not fully realized. So make sure the sketch is fully detailed, fully shaded, before moving on to the final piece. Now let's talk about the final stage, which is the execution of your final image. The most important thing to tell you is to copy your sketch to the very last detail. So you can use a projector, you can use the gridding process. If you guys are not familiar with the gridding process, you can look it up. But basically it involves gridding off your sketch, making a grid on your final painting or drawing surface, and then going grid by grid and transferring your sketch. Stay as faithful to your sketch as possible. Trust the fact that you've made the best possible decisions in your final sketch and follow through. Otherwise, deviating from the sketch when you're doing the final image is a form of sabotage. And consistently in my classes, where I have students go through this process, do final sketches, and then, for whatever reason, they deviate from the final sketch, the image is weaker for it. Now, of course, to be honest, there are exceptions where the image is better. It does happen. But generally speaking, where the areas of the sketch are vague or where the students deviate from the final sketch, those are going to be areas of weakness in the final project. Another reason why it's so important to stay faithful to the sketch is professional. Let's say I have a client that hired me to do a piece. Usually the payment is broken down into 3 parts. There's a deposit to start the sketch and maybe buy materials. And then you bring in the sketch, the client signs off on the sketch, and then you get the last payment, the third payment, once you've delivered the final project. If you do a very clear, detailed sketch that details exactly what you want to do, and the client doesn't like your final piece, it's the client's fault. Right? The client saw the sketch, the client was informed exactly what the plan was. If they don't like it, then they have to pay extra money, and it could be written into the contract, right? Alterations, changes made at whatever it is, $100 an hour. However, if you bring in a sketch, the client signs off on it, and then you bring in the final piece, and there's some kind of deviations, you open yourself up to tremendous risk. If the client doesn't like the piece, they'll say, wait a minute, you promised me this and this in the sketch, you didn't do it. Then you'll be forced to make the changes, make the corrections at your own expense. And often those kind of situations will make you unemployable. The client will not hire you again. Why? Because you're not reliable. You didn't follow through on the sketch. So for the sake of creating an efficient workflow, and also to safeguard yourself professionally, make the sketches extra clear. Spend way more time on the sketches. Often I spend more time on the sketches, making corrections, making changes, than I do on the final piece. Right? The final piece could be done very quickly, but there's a lot of thinking that goes into the final sketch. This is really important. Here is one of the most important points I can make about this entire process. Let's go over the different stages. So we start off with research, then we move to the concept studies, then we moved to the compositional studies, then from the compositional studies we move to the final sketch until we enter the final execution. There can be additional intermediate steps between these stages. So for instance, it can be a fairly big leap to go from the compositional study to the final sketch. So you might want to do some larger compositional studies, some refinements, for example, so preliminary final sketches before that. There could be some additional steps between the final sketch and the final execution, so color studies, for example. Depending on what kind of image you're doing, technical studies. If we're doing mixed media, you can experiment with different combinations of media, different painting surfaces, for example. So we can include different steps. And so you can customize this process based on the kind of work you're doing. However, this is the most important thing. You want to pretend like you're playing some kind of video game like, I don't know, Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider. Imagine we're in this stage right here. So we're in the concept study stage. Concept. Your goal here is to fill this room with whatever number of concept studies you plan on doing. So let's say it's 10. You're here. This is the little video game character, right? Once you've chosen your favorite concept study, then you're going to crawl through to the next chamber. You are now in the compositional study. You're in the compositional study chamber. You are here. Once you've chosen your favorite concept study and crawled to the next chamber, there is some kind of cave-in. Giant boulders have filled in the passage. There is absolutely no way to go back. Your only option is to move forward. Once you do the compositional studies, so we have, again, whatever number you have or whatever time you have for compositional studies, you choose your favorite compositional study and then you crawl into the next room, which is the sketch. There's a cave-in behind you and there's absolutely no way of going back. You are now in the sketch room. You have your favorite compositional study. Do not change your composition because what that means is that you're back in the compositional study room. Don't change your concept because that means that you've just crawled back to the concept study room. You're now in the sketch room. Your only job is to be specific, use reference material, and do a fully realized sketch based on the compositional study that you chose. The same thing here. Once you've completed the sketch is detailed, it's fully realized. There might be some additional supplementary sketches. You crawl to the next room, you start working on your final image based on your final sketch. There's a cave-in. There is no changing the composition, there's no changing the values, the details. All you're doing is blowing up the sketch and completing your final project. In this process, you are always moving forward, you're never going back. You're always moving forward. Why is this super duper important? Because often what happens with beginning artist students is that they go through the concept study stage, they choose their concept, they move to the compositional studies, they start working on the compositional studies, and then they hear a voice. And that voice sounds something like this. Go back. Your idea is bad. It's not going to be good. It's going to fail. No one's going to like it. It's a horrible idea. Choose again. And they drop their concept study, they go back, they might do more concept studies, they might choose a different concept study, and then they might warily crawl back into the compositional study room, and then they might actually power through and do a compositional study they like. Then they go to this room, they start working on the sketch, they hear the voice again. Go back, your composition's bad, your idea's bad, choose another idea. And then maybe they'll be back in the compositional study, but chances are they're back in the concept study room once again. And this process can continue where you're moving back from chamber to chamber, and eventually months from now, weeks past the deadline, past the end of the semester, they're still working on their project. Going back is a form of self-sabotage because often enough, that voice actually has nothing to do with the quality of the idea you've chosen or the quality of the composition you've chosen or the sketch. It has to do with your own personal insecurities. The fact that, look, creating art is a really insecure position to be in. We're constantly criticized. We have to present our babies to the world, subject them to criticism, right? It's an uncomfortable process that we have to develop a thick skin to be able to tolerate. But by practicing moving forward, it prevents that kind of self-sabotage. Again, in most cases, the reason why you're hearing that voice has nothing to do with the actual idea you've chosen, the actual weakness in the composition or the sketch. It has to do with something else. It could be with stress. Often when I'm stressed, I'll have more self-sabotaging voices in my head than normal. But the fact is, they never quite go away. They're still there sitting on the shoulder. You just stop listening to them. You realize that they actually have nothing to do with the quality of your work. This allows you to become efficient in your work process. So when you're given a project, you know exactly how much time you're going to spend on each stage, or what the amount of steps you're going to take. And it's going to allow you to gauge how much time it's going to take to complete a project. And if you're an illustrator or even a fine artist, by the way, fine artists often work on very tight deadlines. They have to submit their work for photography or to be framed by a certain deadline. Otherwise, disaster is going to happen. Right? So you have to learn how to complete work on time. And this process is going to help you do that. Now, are there such things as bad concepts, bad compositional choices, bad sketches? Yes, of course. Of course there are. If you're in the compositional study stage and you start hearing the voice and it's unrelenting, saying like your concept is bad, my advice is to, if you can't power through, if you've got this really strong unrelenting voice, is to ask yourself, what exactly is it about the concept that is potentially weak? And then see if you can write, if you can articulate an actual paragraph or two describing it. If you can create some kind of clear paragraph describing why exactly the concept is weak, then maybe, I still wouldn't, but you can go back and choose another one or do more concept studies. But in most cases, when people are forced, my students, are forced to actually articulate why it is their concept is weak, they don't really have anything, right? It's just some kind of nagging, pulling instinct saying no, 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 no. Right? The same thing with the compositional studies, same thing for the sketch. Again, in most cases, that voice really should be ignored. Now guys, working through this process and not going back takes tremendous confidence. Right? It takes gall, it takes chutzpah. Why? Because in the concept study stage, you're really, really far away from the final execution. There's a number of different steps. You're going mainly on instinct here when you're making those decisions. Compositional studies, since they're more specific, can be, you can anticipate more, you can use rules to make decisions, right? By the time you get to the sketch, you realize whether your piece is strong enough, right? But going from here all the way to here is a little bit of a gamble, right? So we're going to always push forward, and even if we don't have confidence, we're going to train that confidence. We're going to train ourselves to push forward and never go back, and over time, by acting as if we're confident, we're going to become confident. And by the way, full confidence is the purview of bad artists, right? We all have, insecurities. We all have doubts. None of our work is perfect. We have to act as if, because otherwise, that self-sabotaging instinct is going to make us either unemployable or just ineffective as artists. And I've seen plenty of examples of that, both in my life as a professor and among my artist friends. I had an artist friend who was really brilliant, but could never finish anything. Why? Because he didn't have this stick-to-itiveness, right? He'd start something and then go back and wallow. And as a result, right, I couldn't finish. I don't think he finished a single work of art in art school. Brilliant artist, absolutely brilliant artist, but never trained in this particular method. So always push forward, act as if you have confidence, and over time, that confidence will develop. The last thing I want to say about this is that the creative process can be really chaotic, right? Our minds are flooded with all different kinds of ideas at every possible stage. And plus, we experience these waves of emotion as we're working on our projects. I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but you start on something, it's full of promise, you're really happy with it, it's full of potential, and then at some point you start getting tired and your emotions towards your piece start to plummet. You start getting stressed, it starts becoming difficult, we start disliking our project intensely. So it goes from this high where this is the best thing I've ever done, I'm so happy I'm working on this, to this is the worst thing I've ever done, I regret even thinking about starting this project, back up, down. And often our relationship, our attitude towards the work of art has nothing to do with the quality of the art itself. It has to do with outside pressure. So when I start a project, I'm still fresh, full of optimism. Then at some point at 3 a.m., right, I'm sick of it. I don't want to look at it anymore. Right, there's a tight deadline. The client's going to hate it. Right, so we go through this emotional roller coaster. By compartmentalizing the problem into simple steps, it helps make the process much more efficient because we're really not allowed to self-sabotage ourselves and go back. So if we have an emotional roller coaster in this compositional stage, we're forced to power through it and move on to the sketch stage where hopefully our attitudes are going to improve. I hope all of you enjoyed this video, which deviates so much from my usual content. And if you did, please let me know so I know to make more things like it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back in my messy studio with my usual art instruction and art material reviews very soon. Bye-bye.